Welcome to the Hybrid Remote Center of Excellence. This is a conversation with myself, Nola Simon, the host, and Shana Horrigan, who is a member of Urgent Optimists with me. This is a community that is run by Institute for the Future, based on the book by Jane McGonigal. And it's been one of the most interesting things that I've been involved with. And Shana and I have been chatting along with two other gentlemen for about a year now as future buddies. And this is representative of a conversation that we often have. And so it's free ranging, it's interesting. Sometimes we have no idea where the conversation has taken us, and we have to regroup and figure out how we got to where we are. So it is a longer conversation. There is method to our madness. So I encourage you to listen and follow along with us.
Really talk about mindset and futures thinking. And we talk about the liminal space because we're going through massive amounts of change in the world. And that's really where we thought that we would record this conversation and just see what you can take from this because it's a different way of thinking about the world and it's quite interesting. So we wanted to share that with you. So is there something that you wanted to start the conversation with?
You brought up mindset and transition, all of it, and it seems very much that we're in this liminal space. A friend of mine calls it a peduncle, which is from brain cerebral medical term, and it's like a narrowing of type of a passageway where information flows more quickly. And it just feels like that. It feels like we're all being squeezed and pressed in all these different ways of, for need, lack of a better word, to level up of our game as humanity. And that's quite a tall order, right? Because it's for all of us. We're seeing all the things that we're so used to that create a stability in life. We're seeing a lot of them fall by the wayside, even though we're in some way trying to stabilize it by some people trying to go backwards and holding us to these old standards, because the reason we have this chaos and this transition is because they're crumbling, but it's the opposite. They're crumbling because they're no longer meeting the needs of the future for our planet. And we're just past 8 billion people. And so that's 8 billion brilliant minds on this planet that can create an amazing future for all of us. And yet we're still struggling with some of the difficulties from the past, things like getting everybody fed, which we know is possible, but we're not doing it. So why are we not doing it? What is it in our systems that we have not managed to channel this abundance that we have on this planet in a manner that's life-giving to everybody, for instance? And so mindset has a lot to do with that. A mindset I see at the bottom of everything, because if you come from a position of fear, you will take certain action steps. Or if you come from a position of abundance and love, you will take other action steps. So what is at the bottom of our beliefs really drives how we show up in the world. And that's why it's so important to start examining our own beliefs. If I'm afraid I'm not going to have food tomorrow, my vision narrows to just needing to get food, which means any kind of opportunities that arise along the way, I will not even see. But when I come from a position of where I'm focused on being of contribution and helping my fellow man, gratitude is of a higher vibrational frequency, and we tap into that. We see more options, we see more possibilities, and that means we're also going to take actions that are more generative to everybody.
And the group that we belong to is called the Urgent Optimists. And really, where this is all based in a book that Jane McGonigal wrote, who's part of Institute for the Future. And really, when you're thinking about the future in a positive way and looking at it not with shadow imagination, like as in this is the worst thing that could happen, but what is the best thing that could happen? It really shifts the perspective, right?
Yeah, you ask better questions. And in the end, it all boils down to the quality of questions we ask ourselves. Because we will find answers for either one of those questions, whether it's the ones that are, I think in 12-step terms, they call it stinking thinking, or whether we ask ourselves the questions with a positive result in mind. What is it that we can do here, rather than why is this coming at me? Why is this happening? It's not going to give you the same answers as what is it that we can do here to create a great result for everybody. And our brains will come up with answers based on whatever questions we ask them. So the possibilities are there.
And that's something that we talked about the other day is what you pay attention to is what will flourish. So if you're constantly looking for the sky falling, you're going to see the sky falling.
Yes. Yeah, at the same time, there's that argument that people who are like, oh, optimism is denying what's happening on the level of fact, but that's not what it is. It's seeing what's on the level of fact and being determined to do better. So I don't bypass whatever it is that's happening. There's a lot of suffering happening. So when we're looking as futurists at the future that we want, at a preferred future, it's never saying that the suffering isn't happening. Yeah. So that's something to keep in mind.
It's not denying what's happening. It's just almost like plotting a course, right? Futurism is not really about prediction. That's something that a lot of people don't necessarily understand. They think that futures thinking is about predicting what's going to happen, but it's more about what is the idea of the future that you want to see and how do you plot a course to get there? And that may not look like a straight line, right? It's like an adventure quest, because we often talk about gaming as well too, because Jane is involved in gaming, and gaming has a huge opportunity and is really tied into skill building and positive thinking and storytelling. And it's really fascinating to think about the world from a game perspective. And Shauna's been involved in more games than I have been. How are we using the language of gaming and quest to really tell these stories?
I like him. First, there's that underlying hero's journey story, right? Joseph Campbell and all that. And it's a great way of looking at it and looking at each other, at each individual as being a hero on their own journey, on their quest. And gaming is also a natural way of how we learn. This is exactly how we learn. This is how we learn to walk. This is how we learn to do anything. We just sometimes lose sight of how we learn because we think oftentimes that old punitive model somehow creates results when it doesn't really create the results in the long term that we want. It keeps a kid from running into the road maybe, but it will not set them up for success in life. So I love the idea of gaming because it works with our systems. Talking recently about the limbic system, for instance, right? Our limbic system is that system also that creates that fight, flight, and freeze, right? It's the sympathetic part of the nervous system, right? And that part I sometimes hear in this mindset conversation more as like a little bit like vilified as, oh, we need to get away from our fear response. We need to come from our forward thinking, from our optimism, from our more positive side. But to me, it's much more of an integration. And the limbic system is also a system that responds to the dopamine rewards. Right. It's heavily involved in addiction. That's the other part of it. And that's another conversation for another day. But the using the limbic system and the reward system that goes along with it is putting that part of us in the proper perspective. Right. It's not the part that makes us, oh, here's a problem, let me run. But here's a problem. Oh, here I learned how to fix this part. And here's how I learned to fix this part. And at that time, I also got a reward for it. And so we break it down in these little steps and we get our little reward feedback and we build that up and we keep building that up until we create and grow capacity for resilience, for bigger things.
So it's almost, how can you actually use the way that we're wired to have the freeze or flight or whatever the limbic system is actually doing? How can we actually treat that more as like data and not necessarily react to it?
Make it work for us.
Make it work for us.
Learn to work with our nervous system. I see more and more conversations too around like the vagus nerve, and we're taking a hold or taking charge in a way of our parasympathetic nervous system by noticing when we're being hijacked into that sympathetic part with the fight, flight, and freeze, where we're not really, where our vision narrows, where we're not as in charge, our emotions go up, to shifting. And breathing is a big part. So you see a lot of work now, breath work, that decades ago as a singer, I engaged with that. And I just love seeing how much more and more breath work is coming into this idea of mindset shifting, because that's exactly what it does. Is that's the easiest and quickest way to regain hold again of when that sympathetic nervous system, the fight, flight, freeze kicks in. And I also love that we're actually talking about fawn as another one of those of the sympathetic nervous system, because that's one we're learning more nuance around some of those things. Fawn is the one that we are afraid, and we start cultivating the people that we think can keep us safe. This is why you have a lot of people that become these hangers on. They're in their sympathetic nervous system for the most part and looking to be with a strong man.
Yeah.
As a way to calm that part of themselves down. And that's something that had been overlooked for a long time because we got so stuck on the fight, flight, and freeze. And then there's the F that's not an F in the biology book that we don't really talk about as much. And it is part of it, but it's not as dominant as Freudian psychology would probably have you believe.
Well, and if you think about fawning from like an office type response, like this is the suck up.
Yes.
And so what's happening in a hybrid remote world is the people who have this fawn instinct, it's harder for them to really cultivate that, or at least they have to find different tools to be able to do that. And so I think that linking it back into an instinct that's hardwired helps us reframe why people do that and the importance of it to identity, really, because it's not like you're sucking up because you want to, it's because you're craving that level of stability and safety.
Right. Yes. Yeah. And in the end, it's so much of what we do is about to live in futurists call the VUCA world: volatile, uncertain, complex, ambiguous. And I'd like to add like impermanent goes in a way with volatile, but it's a thing that needs to be highlighted because that's one of the triggers for us is that fear of death. In the end, all fears are just one fear, and it's the fear of death. And the fear of change is closely related to the fear of death because that's really what we look at. When things change, things become unstable, and then we become afraid.
And we're afraid of losing. We'll act to protect what we have rather than move towards something that's an opportunity.
Yes. And in the end, if you want to talk about this in the mindset paradigm shift framework, this idea has been around for a while in different disciplines, that it is currently occurring. It's certainly happening in the realm of philosophy and mindset conversations, that we are coming out of a time period, an evolutionary time period of our mind that is closely tied to Newtonian physics, cause effect, hierarchies, those types of structures, and moving into one of more networked quantum talking about quantum entanglement, talking about all these physics concepts that sometimes get hijacked by pseudoscience. But on the philosophical end of it, it's a different way of looking at it. So if I look at creating and empowering the world around me, and I have a hierarchy versus a network, we're moving to the network. And the reason for this is that in order to empower any system, to level it up, we need to look at the structure of the system. Right. Oftentimes, when we look at systems thinking, we look at the system rather than what energy flows through the system. But right now, we're at this place where the idea of energy, to empower anything, it needs to flow through a structure. And the structure needs to have the flow go effectively and efficiently. And the hierarchy is no longer an effective and efficient system for our flow of how we are changing as humans. It's not responsive in a world of continuous change and fast change that's happening.
Right.
And this is why we're also seeing the systems crumble, where a network is the power is more decentralized and it's much easier to respond. And I love looking at it from this perspective of fractals. We're like moving into everything is into smaller and smaller pieces. So smaller and smaller self-sustaining. And it decentralizes the power, which of course makes the old power structure very nervous because power is in the process of being redistributed very differently. And so how can we live in this VUCA world as these systems are changing for us and support others? The rising tide, I heard someone else talk about it the other day. Rising tide raises all ships. I like that metaphor because it helps us go out of, because the old paradigm also is the one of competition. And the new paradigm is the one of co-creation. So just because you get something doesn't mean I get less. It means because you get something, I can get something too, because if you can get it, I can get it too.
And that's actually the tagline that I use for my podcast is let's co-create the future of work, right? Because no one person has the answer, but together we can create what it is we want to see.
Yeah. Yes.
And it's interesting because I'm fascinated by network science as well too. And hierarchy is not something that has ever actually worked in my favor. So for me, I love the shift towards network because a few people can really make an impact. There was an article I read about network science, and it was really just in an organization of, say, 650 people. They only needed 92 people to really be able to make connections, to have information flow adequately throughout that system.
It's fascinating.
Right. And that's really what happened during the pandemic. Like you were talking initially about those pathways getting smaller, like the silos that happened throughout the pandemic and the communication when everybody was shifted to remote. Those pathways broke down because people were leaving, the great resignation, whatever you want to call it, and institutional knowledge was leaving. You only need 90, like a third of your staff to really be able to step up and really want to build those connections. It's just you have to have that right mindset to know that's important and to dedicate resources to building that.
Yes. Yes. And it's also those becoming aware of those intersections, those nodes that are ones of power.
Right.
Because it's not always the ones that seem obvious to us based on our old hierarchical systems. Because as we're seeing systems overlap right now, we look at some title and we assume that's where the power arises, or that's where the power sits in this organization, when in fact it may not be there at all. They might be a complete figurehead. They might have been intended to be the person of power, but in the end, the true power resides in each one of us and the level of influence we have. And that depends on how good we are at being real with ourselves and invested in our own personal growth and being willing to learn from those around us rather than be threatened by them.
And that's the thing. It's how you define what power actually is. Because if you ask me if I want power or if I want influence, I'm going to pick influence every time.
And to me, when I talk about power, I talk much more about energy, because we have intrinsic power, and then there's the external power. External power is something that is given to you, like a position, can also be taken away. Internal power is something that you grow and keep growing, and that can never be taken away from you. You can be in a position where you don't necessarily see it, but it can't be taken away. There's so much conversation now about abundance too, and the old notion wants us to think of abundance meaning more, excess, and whatever it is that we want at any given time, when abundance really is the recognition that everything is here already, and it includes the things that we may not label as desirable, right? But it is part of the human experience, and recognizing that has you interact with the world in a very different way.
You already have what it is you need.
Right.
How do you open yourself up to the opportunities and go forward?
Right. So it's not something you get. It's something that you tap into, and
that's a lot of the leadership advice that I'm seeing as well too. Is it's not that anybody has to teach you how to lead. It's really focusing on yourself and tuning into what you already know.
Yes, it's more about getting out of the way and removing things than it is to adding something more. That's where like Greg McEwen's essentialism is really great around that. Is just really looking, what is it that is actually empowering my life?
Right. And that's where it's like, with all of this talk about burnout and employee wellness and just going hardcore, it's more about what you can subtract rather than adding hours, adding work, doing more. It's focusing on what really makes the difference and do more of that.
And when you have employees that are there and you put them in the proper position, you have a powerhouse. And you will start recognizing also that putting someone somewhere as someone who's dependent for their survival needs in a position just because you need an employee there, you're actually creating more wreckage, not just in their life, but in your organization. Because you want to empower your organization just like anything else, like yourself. You want to empower it, so you want to have the right people in the right places, and you don't want to chain them to their desks because you're not going to get the results. And when they want to be there, when they're on board with the mission, I think oftentimes companies aren't even really clear on what their mission is anymore, and that's part of VUCA, right? because we are hardwired from the old systems, right? I asked someone the other day, it was a community organization. I asked them, so what's the mission of your organization? And the answer was, and he's a community leader, great guy, that has done a lot for the community, but his answer was, bring jobs here. It's like, that's not a mission. Bringing jobs somewhere is like, why? You want to empower the community, right? You want to have the community thriving. You want people to be here. This is not about, jobs is not a goal. So just like money is not a goal. That's we can have this whole conversation that I'm having with some other people around reimagining how we look at money. Because right now, most of us have money as this is what we want, because then we can get what we want, what we really want. But what it does is actually obscures us to start thinking what we really want, because we're still waiting for the money to get there. And it creates this freeze, if you will, of moving forward. Because in the end, no one wants money. You can't eat it. It's not really great for anything, except for, I like calling it the lubrication of trade.
I was just going to say, it removes friction.
Right, it removes friction. Unless the system creates these bottlenecks and these dams where people end up hoarding it, not creating a whole heck of a lot with what it is possible to create with that kind of money. And then the rest of the system has the sense of it's not there. And so how do we go from, oh, I have to get the money before I can do that, to this is what I really want and I'm going to go for it, and then I'll figure out how the money comes in afterwards. I'm taking the steps, and I teach brave thinking, which is a methodology of going for those dreams, for those bigger things that you want to do. And part of that is doing what you can from where you are with what you have. That's one of the main principles of that. But in order to do that, you first need to have a vision of what is it. Money often sits in front of that vision. Right. Because it's very convenient to say, yeah, I'd go for something that's have my own island, or I don't know, go for a vacation or travel the world. Well, what does that mean, travel the world, right? Where would you go if you traveled the world? It's very vague to say traveling the world, and then you can put that big mountain of say, oh, this is going to cost a lot of money to do this, so now I'm going to work. And most people who have something like that as a vision in some form either live a minuscule part of that vision, or they don't live it at all. They die before it even happens, because they're too busy accumulating this money, but not realizing that money is really not what they wanted.
Yeah, exactly. And that's, I think, where some of this workation and like digital nomadism is actually coming into play too, is like people are actually working while traveling, leveraging like their paid time off and leisure time to be able to do more of what it is they want to do. Right. They just need organizations that are going to support that vision in terms of autonomy and flexibility and trust.
That would be speaking to that abundance part in the paradigm shift. We're moving from the old paradigm as either or. You either have this or you have that, but to one of yes, and I can do this and I can do that. So what is it that I need to do? And that comes back to the questions for organizations also to ask themselves and say, why am I here? What is it that we're doing? What is it that we are contributing to the world that makes the world a better place? And money is not the answer, and jobs is not the answer, and yet still we're living from that old paradigm, which is why we're spinning in a way out of control. I look at Wall Street much more as a casino right now. It used to be where you traded money, but now it's like with hedge funds and then derivatives and all of that. You're ending up going into it's a legalized gambling with other people's money. And that then
think about what the crypto meltdown.
Right. And it had such great vision, right? Crypto had this vision of decentralized money, meaning everybody had access to it, but the mindset wasn't there. Everybody's still recreating the old system. So no matter what it is, the currency we're going to end up using, unless we shift the mindset to this, I want to make a contribution. We all just need enough money for the survival part, and then to be able to be creative enough to give what we want to give. Yeah. So the answers are, there's no big answer out there to be found really in each one of us, what that means for each one of us. And I like the notion of taking that into organizations. because we're learning this hero's journey. There's been a lot in self-development, and individual people are beginning to more and more start creating this in their life. And I also see that in the pandemic, a lot of people woke up that hadn't woken up to that yet, which is also why I don't see a lot of people just streaming back into their old jobs, at least not in the long run, maybe in the short run to meet some bills or whatever, but not in the long run, because there's now this hunger for more self-actualization in a lot of ways. So you will see a lot of cottage industries. A lot of people started doing those from home, and we're going to see the result of a lot of that. So for me, as I look into futurism and thinking, what does that mean for organizations? Organizations are also, I guess, aside from the Supreme Court decision about them being like people, why not start thinking about this more? An organization is also an entity that we're creating out of more people together. It's a type of community. And on that note, it's those mission statements and strategic plans that used to be created with a lot of groaning and often very ineffective ones over the years. Those are really wonderful tools. The values of the organization, what's even the purpose of the organization? And if it boils down to making a lot of money for a lot of rich people, then if that's what you want, by all means, but I don't think it's generative in the long run for everyone.
So what's the clothing company? I can't think of the name of it right now. What?
Was it Patagonia?
Patagonia. Thank you.
Yes.
I knew you would know.
Yeah.
So you think about what their mission statement is. They make clothing that is really high end, that really lasts for a long time. They've got a fundamental commitment to sustainability. And he gave away the company.
Yeah.
Now, there's a lot of cynics about that who thought that he did that really for tax purposes and whatnot. But what's your thought about that? Is that the type of mission that you're talking about?
I like that he did that because that's what he was called to do. I don't necessarily think that this is something like everybody should do this, because everything is highly individualized. And I also believe much more in transformation than I do in dismantling and destroying. So more transformation from the inside. But I think it's certainly something in keeping with how that organization has been run.
Yeah.
And how it's been created. It speaks to the future vision of acknowledging we can't keep living forever in a waste society. We need to really look at that and harness waste as byproducts that get recycled back into the flow of things. I had a friend years ago who her job was to connect companies with where the waste product of one company was the input of another company. And I love that. That was like 20 years ago. And I like the idea even of that someone had that foresight to do that. And we're going to be doing more of it.
Yeah. And you're seeing that with plastics now, right? People are harvesting plastic from the ocean and converting that into different products.
And there's all these opportunities. For the longest time, as a futurist, most of us were geeks in some form. We're like the science fiction. So I always wanted my food replicator because I just had the
Earl Grey hot.
I'm still plugging for that one. But it's also
Me too.
I want it in my lifetime, man. But there is this other thing that we're having now with the ability to use plastic to print, 3D printing, right? It is possible right now, not for the individual household, unless they have a whole lot more money and more space to set this up, but it's possible to take your plastic waste, put it in the one machine, and it be the raw plastic for your 3D printer. So it's the theory behind it is all there, and in some lab they've done this. Every time you throw a plastic bottle away or put it, we're not very good at recycling either here where I am. Every time it even goes into the recycling, I'm like, I feel horrible. I look at the plastics that I buy and I'm not where I want to be, respect to that. And there's all room for all of us, but the answer isn't at, oh, we all need to get really strict and rigorous around this. It's about reimagining what we can do with it. And I love that challenge that we have in the Urgent Optimists around the zero waste notion. That's waste is suddenly nobody takes waste anymore. What do you do? Right? And there's going to be that backlog, and everything you wanted to throw out before you start thinking about what could I do with this? This is where the hoarders can come in and help us out with their imagination of what they were going to do with all the stuff that they hung on to, because that was the thinking. The thinking was, I can't throw this out because there is some use for it somewhere. So,
do you think hoarding is actually based in creativity? or is it a lack of abundance?
I think it's more, I think it's complex. I think in the end, trauma has a lot to do with it. I think a lot of mindset issues for a lot of us have to do with trauma. But yes, I think it's blocked creativity is definitely there. There's other things. Fear of loss is also one of those bigger things that keep us from seeing abundance because we're so afraid. And then there's, you go into neurodiversity and trauma responses and all these different ways that we don't even know yet what is doing what. But I know, for instance, being PhD neurodiverse, that I hang on to stuff, even when I know I don't really need to hang on to it because I'm afraid that out of sight, out of mind. So sometimes things that are memories that really don't need to be hanging around here, I'm still hanging on to. And I'm getting better every day, letting it go. But there's that fear of losing the memory when the item itself isn't really useful in any way and is actually in the way a lot. So I see some of that, and I love that they include psychologists, coaches, and so forth to working with the people, because it's not about the stuff. It was never about the stuff for people. It was just a symptom. Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So where do we go from hoarding? Hoarding money, we're hoarding stuff, we're hoarding ideas. And that's really where a community comes in. It's like, how can we build out a community? At least we can share the idea.
And you asked too, is I ask myself as I do my own internal work on this, where's it coming from in the fear? Then on the organizational level, and humanity, for me, the bigger is the humanities level of the evolution of human consciousness is my huge interest in all of this. Is like, how are we growing as a species? Because evolution isn't over. Where there's all kinds of places this could go, and we have amazing brains that that have all kinds of possibility and capability that we haven't even tapped into yet. And this is not, yes, that there's the 10%, but not the 10% that we're only using 10% of our brain, but that there's a capability of connecting synapses, and that by connecting more synapses, we will have, I'm not a neuroscientist by any stretch of the imagination, but I find reading about it really interesting, and it's growing these connections such that we will be capable of doing more and more. And there's where future intelligence, I love future intelligence work, grows the power of imagination.
Yes.
And we have so much capability, and yet it still feels like we're so rudimentary with so many things. Like we can look back pretty decently, but when we look forward, our imagination, it has difficulty extending out and imagining things that haven't happened yet.
And it's also a cognitive block too, right? So if you're imagining yourself in the future, you can't really effectively imagine that, most people, right? You're a stranger to yourself. There was actually a recent, one of those icebreaker questions is, if you had the choice of going back in time and meeting yourself at any point during your time, would you choose to go back or would you choose to go to the future? And of course, I choose the future because I haven't met that version of myself.
Yes, I would definitely go into the future.
Yes.
Yeah. And the questions I would be asking is, okay, you love your life. What is it that you would have done differently being where you are? So where are the spots that I need to make different choices?
Yeah. And that often comes out too, is what's the advice you would give your younger self? And it's, you know what, that's boring. I'm not interested in that at all, because whatever it is, it happened. I'm not going to change it. You can't change it. But if you were to go into the future, what I would ask is, where did I waste time? What did I pay attention to? That was just a waste of time.
And some of it we already know today. It's like, maybe that hour you went surfing on social media wasn't the smartest.
Sorry, what was that?
Maybe that hour you went wasting on social media wasn't the best investment of your time. So some of it we know already.
Right. The doom scroll is not going to make the annals of history.
Yes. And the power of small choices in the moment. That's something we completely and utterly underestimate. I saw this meme forwarded to some friends, and it was about this idea that we're so terrified in all the stories that are like time travel stories, when we go back, making one change that totally will change the future. And yet at the same time, we think that doing something a little bit differently is not going to affect anything.
Yeah.
It's the same principle, and yet in one we see this massive effect, and in one we completely discount it.
The power of tiny habits.
Yes, exactly. It's especially about these consistent habits. And the ability to imagine yourself in the future is also one that's really important for brave thinking, for this modality, because creating a vision for yourself allows you to tap into the energy of what it's like to be that, which means you are more likely to get there faster, because you're going to take actions in the present that are coming from that higher version of yourself. There's so many fascinating things around memory and intuition and imagination and decision making and how we harness these powers that we have. And there's more and more discovery happening right now. So it's a really exciting time to be alive in terms of seeing things moving. They're moving so fast. That's the exciting
Tell me
part.
more about the decision making.
Making is most of the time we make decisions from habit. We make decisions. There's about, I think, like maybe 95% of the decisions we make, we think it through and all of that. But most of the decisions we make, and we make thousands of decisions every day, are done automatically. And even the ones when we think we're going to make a decision for something bigger, that it's all thought out, but we're really kidding ourselves. For the most part, it's not thought out. That part where we're doing the decision making is like when we're first learning something, where you have to pay attention. And this is one of the things, the power of attention is our biggest power. That's the power of attention. And this is why a lot of companies are paying big bucks for our attention, because they know if they get our attention, they can kick in that automatic part, that 95% part. And if they just trigger the right emotions, they will get us to do certain things. And for the most part, that works. And it makes them a lot of money. So it's really crucial for us to take back that power of where we put our attention. And we do that by noticing and getting better and better, noticing where we're putting it during the course of the day. There's influence. There's a book, I forget.
Robert Cialdini?
No, it's the other one. What's her
Zoe
name?
Chance?
Yes, Zoe Chance.
Influence
Fabulous.
is my superpower.
Totally goes into this idea of she says the gator and the judge, which part
Yeah.
of our brain, and I like how she separates it that way. The judge is the part that's in charge of learning, of focused attention when we're first doing something new, and then when something becomes habit and it goes into the automatic part of what we're doing. So where did we start? And I do this all the time. We went to that from, why did I go there? You were asking.
This is how our conversations go.
Yay.
We were talking about decision making.
Yes, decision making, right. And we think that we make our decisions all rationally. So
Right.
Taking the power of decision making back is part of taking our attention back. And then a decision making being this idea much more of a commitment, right? I make a decision, and when going down to decision making as this, I'm cutting away all other options and I'm taking action just on this one. Right. So a friend of mine calls it the triangle. You have a vision of something, you make a decision, and you take action, and then you have vision again, and so forth. And that is that engine that of your creativity that actually produces results that you want to see rather than results by default.
Yeah, and this is actually something that I see happening with like the decision about whether to bring people back to the office or not. Executives are making the decisions and not consulting other people.
Mhm.
And even if there are surveys of their employees that exist, they're not factoring that into their decisions because that's not what they want, right? That's not what serves them and their perception of how they've always been successful. They need to redefine their own personal narratives of success and be able to step outside of themselves to figure out what's actually best for the organization. And so there's all kinds of studies that exist that basically say that I think it's like 46% of executives have said that they are not factoring in what their employees actually want when they're making these final decisions, which seems odd to me because it's like you're setting yourself up to fail because you're planning without input. Your strategy, you're shooting yourself in the foot because you're focusing on what was and not what could be.
It's the old paradigm, right? It's
Yeah.
the old paradigm of looking at labor as a commodity, and which is a huge waste of all the brains that are part of our human ecosystem,
Right.
and abilities and the things that could come out of those brains that could at one point save the world. Because you don't know what is that little thing that somebody had a spark to something. So you want to nurture all of those abilities that we have. And so moving away from the commodity thinking of labor is definitely one of those bigger paradigm shifts. When you said, but what they want is that for everybody to go back, and my mind goes to, no, this is not what they want. This is what makes them feel safe.
Yes, that's right.
So if they go by that instinct of the status quo anytime, the status quo is that which we create as our normalcy in a world. It's very it's an illusion. In the end, stability is an illusion because we know there's could be whatever we don't know, like the asteroid, could upend everything at any given time. So we can only create an illusion of safety so we feel safe enough or stable enough for a while to create, because I think it's part of the condition in order to create, that we create that part of that safe space, if you will, of stability, of where we can create. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. That's right. Not including data that they know will make them feel unsafe.
And then, but in the end, we're living in an expanding universe. So growth is not optional. Okay. So if you can go with it or you can resist it, right? You can go with it, do it intentionally, or resist it. And when you resist it, you will, like a tidal wave, you'll get eventually swamped. Life will happen. You'll get hit by that truck you don't see in the fog because you're on the other side of the road. But knowing that you want to grow and that this is occurring, that gives you the power to start moving intentionally into the growth zone, which is by definition outside of your comfort zone, which by definition will get your sympathetic nervous system all up in arms, which is that mind chatter. The Buddhists call it monkey mind. Will start chattering. Oh my God, you're going out of the safety zone. Bad things.
I love it. We got monkeys, we got gators. There's another author I follow. Right? She talks about elephants in the room.
Love all those
it's all these animal metaphors that help us illustrate these points. The other thing I liked about the Zoe Chance book was the magic question. Do you remember that? What would it take?
Yes. That's
what would it take? You've got an idea. You're trying to negotiate something, and you can hit them with the magic question because it helps them imagine what would be possible.
And it's actually a brave thinking question. So I'm like,
is it?
Good question. Oh, okay.
Sorry.
Yes, it's one of the things. Is like, what would it take? What if? That is the biggest thing. What if it were possible? Yeah, I hear you saying that it's not possible, but just for a moment, suspend that monkey, that gator, whatever. What if? So start imagining, and that's, as futurists, that's one of those things that we are called to engage in all the scenarios and simulations, is that what if? What was that? Rule number 1 of scenario clubs: don't argue with the scenario.
Yes.
It's what if, and jump in and start playing as if that's the case. And you are then open to the opportunities, and you can start seeing the possibilities that you wouldn't see if you were trying to stay safe, if you were trying to maintain the status quo. Never mind that the status quo one time was the horse and buggy. It was Ford that said, if I had listened to the people what they wanted, I would have bred faster horses or something like that, because that's all they could see. But he saw more. He saw, for every person that is heralded as someone who made a breakthrough, like electric light bulb and so forth, they created that with the old technology while their minds were in the future, in a different way of being. And brave thinking talks about it in the sense that everything is created twice. You have to think it first. Everything that is around us, somebody thought up before it ever became a thing, which is alone a really fascinating concept, because we have to think it first. In order to think something, you have to have the power of your attention.
Yeah, it's funny because honestly, like, that's where I got married in Antigua. It was one of the first destination weddings before destination weddings were really a thing. And it really came down to the fact that my husband's family is really large. Like, when my father-in-law died, there were like 400 people there. I didn't know half of them. And my family is 20 with all my cousins. But it's a very different dynamic. And I couldn't afford to host his family. So I'm like, what does a wedding look like without the people? And that's where it's okay, we can go away. It's like a version of elopement, except we took our parents and my husband's sister, and that was it. And that was 98, right? Before our destination weddings were a thing. So it's that sort of thing. It's like, you don't have to accept that's what the traditional, what you have to do. How do you redefine it? What do you want to take from it? So yes, we wanted the wedding. I wanted the dress. He wore a tuxedo. Was that a great idea? It was 108 in the shade. He almost died. I had a crinoline. There are things that I would do differently now that I know that it's possible. But we didn't need the church. We didn't need all of the extra family members. It was really just to get married. And it happened on a beach, and that's what we wanted. And that's what we needed. So strip away this, going back to the idea of essentialism and subtracting. It's like, how do you subtract what you don't want to get more of what you do want?
Right. And then really starting to look what is essential, right?
Yeah.
Because so many times we have this different perspective of what's essential. So I love always going back to the elements of the pieces of the origins of where did something comes from, even when we use language and the etymology of where did something come from, and is this actually what I want to say? Because to me, as a musician, words have power. They're a way of conveying power, and power is, to me, it's like energy. I like looking at it as energy in a way. And so what does it affect, and how does it affect it? And so when you go back down to what's my intention here, what is it that I'm really looking to do? Sometimes the most obvious isn't what you're actually looking to do. And when you're coming from, then you can start seeing, am I coming from the fear, or am I coming from a love and a generative and creative part of myself? And then when you come from that creative part, it's okay, what is it that I really want to create here? And for you, it's like an experience around this lifelong commitment of being married to someone you love. And there's a myriad of ways of acknowledging that and making it happen and making it more meaningful. And oftentimes I find some traditions actually obscure that rather than enhance it. It's not traditions, no, traditions, yes. It's about what are they doing? Are they adding to the experience, or are they actually diluting the experience?
And that's where you get reality TV and Say Yes to the Dress and like all of the things that have gone off the rails.
Yes.
You really need to spend $40,000 on a dress? Probably not.
What would you rather do? Elope and have the travel the world kind of experience? Yeah.
And that's where it comes back down to, what is the intention? What does that actually mean to you? And how are you letting that define?
Right. And then it's also to acknowledge that for someone, that is it. That $40,000 wedding with the awesome dress, for some people, that is it. But is it the way to do it for you? And for the most part, I'd say most people don't, because they're just going with whatever the expectations were.
Well, and now you can rent wedding dresses. Back then, I didn't have the option. We could rent the tux, but I couldn't rent the dress.
Yes,
and I had to buy the dress.
There's all kinds of ways of doing it, and what kind of dress, because my sister dyed her wedding dress afterwards and used it as an evening cocktail dress. So there's different ways of approaching even those things.
Oh yeah, definitely.
Right.
So it's fascinating. But in getting back to the mission statements, I just was thinking, remember, you've heard that anecdote where I was touring NASA and they came across this gentleman who was like a caretaker, and he was cleaning the floors, and he was asked about his job and what he thought about putting a man on the moon. And he's my job is not cleaning the floors. It's about putting the man on the moon. That's why I show up every day. That's why I do a good job, because what I do is contribute to that mission.
Exactly. Right? Yeah. And that's how we show up, based on what we think we're doing.
Right. Exactly. And do you think that ties back into resilience? Because you mentioned resilience right at the beginning of our conversation.
Yeah, I would definitely think so. When we feel like we're having purpose, when we do anything, right, we're more likely to stick with it and roll with the punches, and the things that these seeming obstacles are we find ways to make them stepping stones rather than ways to turn us around and stop. Because when you're not clear about where you're going, any stumbling block can be a potential way for you saying, I'm not doing this, right? But when you know what you're doing is important, you will find a way around it. So yeah, it has everything to do with resilience, I think.
And do you think that resilience, is there such a thing as dysfunctional resilience? So you're trying to force something to happen.
Yes. Yes.
And you stick with it, and you want it to happen. Because honestly, that's why I lasted so long working where I worked. It's because I perceived that I needed that stability, because my husband's a contractor. He's self-employed too. So my perception is my job is essential because I need that stability so that we've got benefits, so that I can make sure that I'm taking care of my kids. And so it becomes almost a dysfunctional type of resilience. I need to make this work.
Yeah.
gives
Yeah.
us that stability.
I would not necessarily call it resilience anymore at that point. I would call it, I'm certainly subject to that on occasion, is headedness is what I call it in myself. It's when I'm doing something just because I'm going to force my way through this because I just think that I want it so bad, and I never stop to really see why, right? Why,
Yeah.
and where's the placement of it, and time to shift or pivot, and we can talk about perception at this point, because that's another one of our superpowers, is our perception shift, because you can do the same thing, still engaged in the same thing, but you're going to start doing it differently when you're in alignment with that purpose of what you're doing. So for your example, for instance, is the acknowledgement that you were doing this right now because you needed the stability, but you are currently right now working on a purpose, for instance, or you already have another purpose for which you know that you're going to be staying in the stability, you have a plan for X amount of time. So it becomes a part of the building block of what you're building, but it's no longer the thing, right? So this is oftentimes when I work with people who are in transition, who are either creating like their own new job or whatever, their new career of what they're doing, and why they're still doing the other thing, is to look at it as it's all the same thing. You're all on this, the way this is just just a subsidiary of what you're doing. And you have a plan to let go and do less and less of it while you're building up this other thing that you're doing. So there's nothing wrong with working, for instance, at McDonald's, for instance, or any kind of fast food for a minimum wage for 6 months, because and just getting that money together because you're going to do something else. But if you're doing that without a vision and you start living by default, that's when the soul crushing stuff comes in, right? So the same thing is true in a way. It's about shifting that perception of where you are with it. Where do I need to look to get back in alignment with my values and my purpose? So what has meaning to me for having a full life experience? Like in coaching, oftentimes I have people envision themselves on their deathbed and looking back, saying, you look back on a life and it was well lived and it was wonderful what you experienced, and all abundance. Yeah, there was pain, there was joy, all of it, but it was a full life. What are the things that you did do such that you had that experience? Such that you do not have, where are places of mess that need cleaned up so you don't die with regrets.
Right.
So 10 minutes before, like another coach, Maria Nemeth from the Academy for Coaching Excellence, that's one of the things that she says, coach for the last 10 minutes of life. Because we want people to come away from having had this experience called life, knowing that they showed up fully. Yeah.
That's a good thing. That's a good perception. So it's about also knowing like what you let go to have a better experience. So for me, for example, with that job, when they came to me and told me that my job was going to be restructured and they're basically taking away all of the autonomy and flexibility that I had worked so hard for, I'm like, okay, I can't force my way through this.
Yeah.
You're either going to appreciate me or not. So at this point, I'm going to tell you no.
Yeah.
Because you're not meeting my basic need. And that's where it's like you let go, because it's like you have to accept things for what they are.
Yeah.
Not for what you want them to be. Right.
Yes.
So if you were coaching me for my life, I'm grateful for the ability to walk away.
Yes.
And to know, I quote Kenny Rogers. I put that in my social media content quite a lot these days, is know when to hold them, know when to fold them, know when to walk away, know when to run.
That's right. Yeah. Yes. And it's the knowing and the intentionally doing rather than the running because you're trying to escape something.
It's more running towards.
Exactly.
What are you running
towards? Exactly.
Right. Thank you so much. I appreciate that. It's always one of those free-ranging conversations, and we have no idea where we're ever going to go, but it's Futures Thinking, the buddies conversations are the highlights of my week. So
yes. Well, it's always exciting to be stimulated by these types of conversations.